Our focus for this week is on two of the most influential feminist anthropologists, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, because their lives provide insights into the ways cultures, gender ideologies, and the field of anthropology have changed over time. In addition to this lecture, you'll complete a homework assignment based on Mead's research in Papua New Guinea, and watch and discuss a film that documents her life and career. Margaret Mead was born in Philadelphia. Her father was a professor of economics, and her mother was a sociologist. The family moved quite often, and her grandmother, who had a great influence in her life, helped to raise her and her 4 siblings. In 1923, she earned her BA in anthropology from Barnard College, which was the women's only college within Columbia University in New York, and later went on to earn her master's degree while studying under Franz Boas, who we've already discussed, and Ruth Benedict. In 1925, she traveled to the island of Samoa to conduct the fieldwork for her dissertation. Upon her return to New York, she was named an assistant curator at the American Museum of Natural History and went on to earn her PhD in 1929. As you read in this week's reading, Mead was married 3 times. After a 6-year engagement, she married her first husband, American Luther Kresman, who was a theology student at the time, but eventually became an anthropologist. Between 1925 and 1926, she was in Samoa, and while returning by boat, she met Rio Fortune, who was a New Zealander headed to Cambridge, England to study psychology. They were married in 1928 after Mead's divorce from Kresman. Her and Fortune traveled to Papua New Guinea for fieldwork, which is where they met the British anthropologist Gregory Bateson, who eventually became Mead's 3rd husband. This was her longest-lasting marriage, and the two had a daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, who would also become an anthropologist. You'll hear more about the latter 2 relationships in the video for this module, as well as from her daughter. Mead also had an exceptionally close relationship with Ruth Benedict. The two met in 1922 when Mead began her studies, and Benedict was working as a TA for Boas at Columbia. Over time, their relationship shifted from mentor-mentee to colleagues and friends, and then eventually to lovers. They both grew up with traditions of passionate and romantic love between women and wrote many letters and love poetry to one another. Before World War I, female relationships involving these types of deep emotions and erotic attachments were seen as innocent and non-threatening. But following the war, the concept of love required making love or having sex, so ideas around same-sex couples changed. Lesbianism was then seen as a threat to societal norms. Overall, they both saw themselves as cultural misfits, which might explain why they were drawn to anthropology and their shared struggles with their sexual identities. While Mead never openly identified herself as lesbian or bisexual, her daughters implied that her mother's relationship with Benedict was partly sexual. In her writings, Mead proposed that it is to be expected that an individual's sexual orientation may evolve throughout life. She spent her last years in a close personal and professional collaboration with Rhoda Metro, who you will also hear from in the video, and with whom she lived from 1955 until her death in 1978. While in the graduate program at Columbia, Margaret Mead was studied under Franz Boas, as I said, and he encouraged her to study the romantic lives of adolescent girls during her fieldwork in Samoa, and to especially observe individuals and the patterns of their behavior. This is what we've come to call participant observation, which was a practice instilled in many students by Boas. This involved establishing rapport with the girls whom she was talking to and living amongst, and this provided her with a degree of empathy not possible for male ethnographers. She was able to access new information and get more explanation than would have been given to a male counterpart. From her perspective, teenage Samoan girls lacked the craziness of romantic or obsessive love, or the notion that one man will fulfill a woman. To quote her, "To live as a girl with many lovers as long as possible, and then to marry in one's own village, near one's own relatives, and to have many children. These were uniform and satisfying ambitions." She was pleased to learn about these alternative ideas about monogamy, jealousy, and fidelity, and we can see this reflected in the tumultuous love life she seems to have had. Her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, became a bestseller, and it launched her into the spotlight. She became what is known as a celebrity anthropologist in a lot of ways because her work delved into social issues that were relevant at the time, especially within the second wave of feminism we talked about in the last module. One of her most famous and controversial books was Sex and Temperament, which documented her findings in the Sepik region of Papua New Guinea. She was there with her husband at the time, Rio Fortune, from 1931 to 1933. They lived among and studied 3 different societies, the Arapesh, the Mandugamor, and the Chambuli. Her observations provide the meat of this week's reading and are also the subject of your first homework assignment. Mead's research in Papua New Guinea focused on determining whether sexes have strict temperaments or what we might now call personalities. So for your first homework assignment, I want you to summarize the gender ideologies that she observed among the 3 Sepik groups. I've listed some questions here to help guide you, including a consideration of whether any social, economic, or environmental factors influence the behaviors she observed among women and men in each group. Your essay submission will include a paragraph about each group and a final paragraph explaining the major conclusions that Mead made regarding sex and temperament. Spelling and grammar will be taken into consideration, so please review and edit your essay prior to its submission. And more details are available on the Canvas submission page. Moving beyond the Sepik, Mead and Bateson married in 1935, I believe while they were traveling to Bali for field work. The video in this module delved into more details about this trip and the research that they conducted there. At age 38, Mead became unexpectedly pregnant while in Bali, so she trained a local pediatrician to help her through the pregnancy and birth of her daughter. What she came to find was that mothering was not a full-time occupation for her. She depended on nannies and extended households to help raise her daughter, and you'll hear from her daughter about her perspective on this in the video. Mead was very much influenced by the sorts of behaviors and child-rearing attitudes that she observed in countries and societies other than the U.S. Ultimately, Mead went on to promote a women's viewpoint in anthropology, and she trained many female anthropologists. But she was really cognizant of the fact that she needed to practice a feminist perspective of equality, so she gave attention to both women and men in anthropological research. She wasn't trying to raise female colleagues above female practitioners, for example. Later in life, she wrote on bisexuality and sought to normalize attitudes toward homosexuality and other sexual orientations. Ruth Benedict was born in New York City to a schoolteacher mother and a homeopathic doctor and surgeon. Her father loved his work and research, but it eventually led to his premature death when he acquired an unknown disease during one of his surgeries. Her mother was deeply affected by her husband's passing, and Ruth hated her mother's sorrow because she viewed it as a weakness. She saw crying in front of people and showing expressions of pain as the greatest taboos in life. Having essentially lost both of her parents at a young age, she became quite interested in death and continued to study how it affected people throughout her career. She and her sister attended Vassar, where Ruth thrived in an all-female atmosphere, and graduated with a degree in English literature. After college, she traveled through Europe and worked a few different jobs, but also suffered from bouts of depression. In 1910, she met and married Stanley Benedict, but by 1918, they had begun to drift apart, which was likely exacerbated by her entrance into the graduate program at Columbia, where she studied under Boas. She earned her PhD in 1923 for her dissertation titled The Concept of the Guardian Spirit in North America. Boas regarded her as an asset to the anthropology department, and in 1931 he appointed her as assistant professor in anthropology, something that was impossible until her divorce that same year. She came to call herself a woman-loving woman, and shared the remainder of her life with 2 female partners. In 1947, she was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and she also became the first female president of the American Anthropological Association, a tenure which ended prematurely with her death from a heart attack a year later. Benedict's most influential work is her book, Patterns of Culture, which was published in 1934 and became a standard textbook in anthropology classrooms for several decades. The thesis of that book comes down to the quote you see here. A culture, like an individual, is a more or less consistent pattern of thought and action. So from her perspective, each culture chooses a few characteristics that become the leading personality traits of its people. Throughout the book, she discusses similar and contrasting cultural traits, and her work comes to form part of the greater culture and personality school of thought that was developing in anthropology at this time. An important facet of that school was the concept of a modal personality, or a cluster of traits associated with a particular culture. Based on the quote above, you can see how her ideas would fit into that logic. This book was considered a paradigm shift in anthropology for its ideas around cultural relativism. Benedict expressed her belief in this practice. She desired to show that each culture has its own moral imperatives that can be understood only if one studies that culture as a whole. She felt it was wrong to disparage the customs or values of a culture different from one's own. Those customs had a meaning to the people who lived them, which should not be dismissed or trivialized. Morality, she argued, was relative to the values of the culture in which one operated. This new theoretical framework replaced the standards of those harsh value judgments from the 19th century that we talked about when discussing the history of anthropological thought. To her, cultural standards are relative to the place, time, and people that are being examined. Within Patterns of Culture, she wrote about topics that continued to interest her throughout the rest of her career. In the book, she studied the Pueblo culture and how they dealt with grieving and death. She describes that individuals may deal with reactions to death, such as frustration and grief, differently. Societies all have social norms that they follow. Some allow more expression when dealing with death, such as mourning, while others are not allowed to acknowledge it. She also went on to emphasize the differences between matrilineal and patrilineal societies, that is, the descent through which we trace our familial relations. She also made a clear statement in her writing about biology when it comes to women. From her, if women are weak, it is because they have learned or are expected to be, not because our biology has predetermined our weakness. It should be clear where she would settle within the nature versus nurture debate. She sought to redefine categories of abnormal and normal by making the point that such connotations are relative to the society within which they occur and need to be considered as part of a larger whole. She also spoke out against the treatment of homosexuality as an illness. She cited her work amongst Native Americans, from whom she learned about two-spirit people, which is something that we'll learn more about in the next module. The onset of World War II and Mead's child care responsibilities prevented more fieldwork after 1940. So Mead and Benedict formed a research team of scholars and citizens from around the world that conducted ethnography without the fieldwork. The team had no hierarchy, just co-equal circles of researchers that shared interests and contributed to a synergistic framework. Together, they developed innovative and interdisciplinary methods with an emphasis on complex modern civilizations grounded in cultural relativism and the culture and personality approach. As feminist anthropologists, they were particularly interested in exploring how the world would differ if women had been the ones to organize and control the institutions that seemed to control society. Thus, they sought to study and compare how women structure interpersonal relationships and activities differently than men. For example, they saw war not as an innate or biological response of humans, but purely cultural, meaning we can change and choose to study war no more. We could teach each other and raise our children to adopt other cultural and psychological means to avoid conflict and destruction. Lastly, and probably most importantly, this research group viewed interpersonal relations as a foundation for productivity. So in this regard, family and personal lives were actually rewarded. It was a good thing if you had a family and a personal life outside of your work, which was a novel concept then and continues to be in some cases today. Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict are considered the two most influential and famous anthropologists of their time. Their lives provide insights into the ways cultures, gender ideologies, and the field of anthropology have changed over time. Together, they inspired a school of anthropology focused on the study of culture and personality, and they pioneered methods of data collection and interpretation that rely on the techniques of establishing rapport, asking culturally open questions, and documenting ideas and behaviors. Both women brought a feminist perspective to anthropology, and encouraged the equal representation of women's lives in cross-cultural analyses. In this way, they provided the foundation for research on gender, cultural relativism, marriage, sexuality, motherhood, and women's work. They shared a passion for their work, and they each felt a sense of pride in the fact that they were successful women working during a time when this was uncommon. Both wanted to dislodge stereotypes about women that were widely believed and to show people that working women could also be successful.